and yeah, introduce Doug Smith from Aviation Australia, who's going to be talking about their implementation. So again, like I did with Anne-Marie, feel free to send any questions through on the chat, and I'll pass them on to Doug. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Alistair. Hi, everybody. Thanks for making yourselves available for this presentation. I was going to mention the State of Origin game last night as an icebreaker, but there's probably a lot of Southerners in there, so I won't raise that at all, and we'll get straight to a little bit about our EQUELLA implementation. So Aviation Australia, we're a aviation training college based out of Brisbane. Our main training centre is in Brisbane, but we have campuses around Australia and even overseas. We focus mainly on aircraft maintenance engineering training, so both theoretical and practical. So we have practical facilities, and that small image there in the left is a sample of the prac training that we have. We also do flight attendant training, a little bit of pilot training, and I guess one of the growth sectors in aviation is the remote pilot training. So that's something that's growing, and we're building our training provision of that in that sector as well, I guess. In engineering training also, we also do ab initio, so training engineers as they join the industry, but also what we call type training, which trains engineers on specific types of aircraft, like a 737 or a Airbus A380 or whatever. So two of those. I'm not sure if you can hear that noise in the background. That's my bird going off. Hopefully you can't hear that. So being the aviation sector, and I'm sure a lot of other training organisations have multiple regulators. For Aviation Australia, we have obviously our Australian Aviation Authority, CASA. We also are authorised to provide training in compliance with the European Aviation Safety Authority. So a second aviation regulator that we have to provide compliance or be audited by on a regular basis. And then as an RTO in Australia, we obviously also have to be compliant with ASQA. So I guess a little bit about that is one of our primary focuses for bringing in EQUELLA was maintaining compliance. So being easily or readily able to illustrate compliance with all of those regulators, because our audit regime is fairly high, I guess, in comparison to some other organisations or some other RTOs. We also maintain content for our sister organisation over in Riyadh, the Aviation Australia Riyadh College of Excellence. So there's another aviation authority over there who we have to illustrate compliance for the content that we deliver for that college. And we also have a less of a alliance, but also the Federal Aviation Authority, so the US National Aviation Regulator. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is it's a heavily regulated environment. So we have to have approvals and authorizations to provide both the practical training and the content training, so that our students walk away with the option for licensing. Yeah, so a little bit more about the approvals we have to conduct training. Again, the primary ones being CASA, our Aviation Authority, the European Authority, and the General Authority of Civil Aviation, which is the Gulf region. So to maintain compliance across all of those, or maintain our content compliance with all of those organisations. We put together a lot of taxonomies, I guess, a lot of terms that we apply to the content so that if we are audited, we can easily search within our repository and pull back the resources relevant to that particular term, so that auditors can readily see what it is we deliver and make sure the content is fit for purpose, but also in accordance with the regulations. That's prior to our implementing our EQUELLA. It's a very time-consuming process, and one of the goals with bringing in EQUELLA was to reduce that rate of effort and try and free up resources to advance our content, to make it more modern, to bring in new interactive content. You'll see a lot of our resources are primarily text-based. There's been a lot of development in the LMS environments, and we want to implement more interactive content and get our students more engaged with what we deliver. So yeah, this slide is, as you can see, our UI is very basic. We've got a long way to go to reach the level of maturity that Anne-Marie displayed, and we were talking about that in one of the rooms just previously. So we'd love to make our interface a little bit more user-friendly and bring in some of that web-based content as we evolve. We've only been with EQUELLA for 2 years, and this is a nose-to-tail project where we brought in EQUELLA and then an LMS right on the back end of that. So we definitely need to spend some more time making our interface more user-friendly for our users. So one of the things that was suggested that I present, given that we're pretty new and not very mature, we talked about our contribution workflows, or our moderation. So that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about today. A lot of this has been developed to align with our internal processes. So at the moment, our moderation, or our editing our content, I suppose we follow a very manual system. We want to use our workflows as a digital-based workflow that records the steps that we follow and who is responsible for those steps as we update content and as regulations change, how we maintain compliance. As part of our implementation, we wanted to make EQUELLA our primary repository. Before EQUELLA came in, we used multiple locations to store our content. So file servers, SharePoint, our legacy learning management system. So there was a lot of effort around maintaining that, and a lot of options for things to get overlooked and missed. So I guess the primary thing around an LCMS is having a single repository where everything is pushed out to the various endpoints for users to access that content. We broke our collections into 5 originally. Our initial process was to migrate all our content from those locations up into EQUELLA. I worked with Carl for what seemed like months and 5,000 spreadsheets to make sure that as we migrated that content, the metadata that we attached to it, it would be searchable and findable. Once that process was complete, we then, I guess, put another moderation or a filter over that to identify what it was we wanted to use and make live. And that content that went through that process, we migrated that into our 2 main collections, which you can see on the screen there. Our master courseware collection which was the text-based content, I suppose, or all of that information that we publish to our LMS, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. A lot of that was PDFs, PowerPoints, Word documents, that sort of thing, and then our master media, which is obviously all of our graphics, videos, some PDFs and that sort of thing. So that's how we initially set up our organisation or our institution. Yeah, on the back end of our LCMS implementation, or our Aquella implementation, we then implemented the launchpad, our Brightspace learning management system. We call it Launchpad, and established Carl set up an LTI for us between those two institutions, and you can see in this image here our resources are pulled into those courses as external links. It's indicated by the icon there. So again, a single primary location for all of our content being pulled into our learning management system via the LTI. Ooh, what's happened there? I've lost some slides. All right. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and go over to our environment. So excuse me a second.
Doug, whilst you're doing that, there's been a question around, do you manually maintain your taxonomies, or are they connected to an external database?
Yeah, great question. It would be great if they were external, but it's a manual process. I guess for us, a lot of those taxonomy terms are derived from regulations. So the aviation regulators are very prescriptive in what it is that we have to deliver to maintain compliance. So we use those regulations as a baseline. We break them down into single terms, and then use those terms as taxonomy terms. So it is a manual process. There is a little bit of maintenance involved, but the regulations themselves are fairly stable. So there's not a lot of overhead around that maintenance. Yeah, so hopefully you can see our UI there. Fairly basic. There's our dashboard. You can see the browse hierarchies that we have set up. Again, as we evolve, some of these will change. One of the projects that will go on the back end of the learning management implementation will be our single source project, which will have a much greater dependency on these taxonomy terms, and we'll need a lot more refinement in them. They'll go a little bit more granular in breaking down our content, and we'll have a quick look at that. Yeah, so I'll just bring up a resource. So you can see our moderation process. So the recording that goes around when we do a resource amendment, or a resource goes through a workflow. Carl has set up a recording process, so whoever does a particular step in that workflow, the actions that they've done are recorded. There's traceability then for everybody who participates in that workflow. And if an issue is identified, or we need to search on a particular text term within that workflow, then we can find the resources that we need that may have been affected by, in this instance, for example, say a particular HDR, which is a help desk request number. We can see that this particular resource, which is one of the modules for one of the regulatory courses, one of the student resources. So one of the things that I didn't mention earlier, sorry, was part of this implementation was also incorporating a lot more adherence to conventions. So naming conventions that defined, consistently defined information about each of the resources. So what regulator it was relevant to, what part of the regulation, what type of resource it was, and also version controlling by using a date convention structure as well. So that's just a couple of them, but yeah, until that's documented and adhered to, it makes searching obviously the content a little bit more difficult. Not that we have a large amount of resources. All up, I think what we ended up coming into our master courseware collection, it was around 20 odd thousand, not even 20,000, sorry, in our master courseware. You can see there, you know, at the moment it's sitting at only 3,300 resources. The files that we brought across in our migration was up around 80,000. So a lot of content, or a lot of files that were obsolete, no longer used. You know, we've been able to refine those resources that we required to push out to our LMS using the moderation workflow, and you know, already we've made our content a lot more manageable and searchable, obviously within EQUELLA. How am I going for time there, Alistair? All right?
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine, Doug. And you know, given one of the earlier sessions went a little bit over, even if we don't do that next networking session, if you've got a little bit to go, that's fine. So yeah,
yep.
You've got up to about 9 more minutes.
Excellent. So the next thing that I wanted to show you was our workflow. So the workflow that we set up, and again, if you'll excuse me, I'll just share the screen again and show you the moderation workflow for our content. We implemented a lot of steps in that workflow. Each moderation step requires certain approvals, and regulations determine who's allowed to maintain or I guess the authorizations within our organization to approve content and maintain content, all regulated. So we wanted to record who was responsible for those steps within the workflow. Again, this workflow that we implemented records those steps, I guess. This was the flow chart that I gave Carl to develop the workflow. I don't know how he did it, but he transferred all that into a workflow within EQUELLA, incorporated the necessary elements, like we wanted to make sure that there were mandatory fields in there that were populated as individual users step through their contribution. We needed to record specific information. There were some obviously that weren't mandatory. We also needed to have the opportunity for content to be returned back to a previous moderation task if there was some work that was still outstanding. So yeah, Carl was able to set the forms up or set the workflows up such that if mandatory information wasn't configured or defined, then that workflow step was not able to be completed. Along with that, each of these moderation tasks, as a resource progressed through the workflow, he set it up so that notifications were sent to the user or the next user in the workflow to notify them that they had a task that they had to do to moderate the content. Another point in this illustration here is that we had a requirement to have a fast turnaround process, so a high priority moderation workflow and a normal priority. So if any of our information that we deliver was identified as being factually incorrect, we've got a requirement there, a compliance requirement to turn that around within 7 days. So the high priority workflow has got much more stringent timelines around when these steps need to be completed. The low or normal priority is a lot less stringent, I guess. Same steps, just the notifications and the alerts are set up so that they are completed in a more, within that 7-day time frame.
And Doug, we've had a question just to confirm that you're using Equella's workflow functionality for these moderation steps. So yes, that's correct. Yes.
So I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. The last point that I'll make out in here is that the final approval process, that resource then goes live and is immediately pushed out to the LMS via the LTI. So that's the workflow. And in answer to the question, yes, I will stop sharing that screen now and go back to Equella and just show what Carl created for us in there. And that is in. So that's what the workflow in Equella that was created in that environment by Equella looks like within the workflows there. So hopefully, that answers the question around the workflows. I don't know if Carl, you had anything to add around that.
No, only that as Doug alluded to, there's certain workflow steps that it's easy to accidentally just approve something without having met the requirements of the workflow. And there's a few critical points in the workflow where what we did was we just scripted it so that if the metadata fields weren't completed properly, then it would the script would just automatically reject it back to the previous step to make sure that that workflow step was properly completed.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, so that's our contribution process. Again, the key factor for us was making sure that we can readily show compliance with the regulations using that workflow and the recording of the data, metadata around it. The other primary thing for us for the Equella, and I guess that's standard for everybody, is to make sure that it's searchable so that resources were easily found, and our developers who then publish that content via the LTI in the learning management system were easily able to find the right resource that they needed to input into the right course. Given that we have multiple regulators and multiple course offerings, it's significant that that we put a CASA approved resource in a CASA approved course, that sort of thing. All right, so the next thing that we did was as a flow on from that, but it was also a primary objective at the start of the Equella implementation, was our single source courseware project. Because of it, we have multiple regulators. There is a very high degree of commonality between them. So as you would expect, maintaining an aircraft, it doesn't matter what country you're into, an engine is still an engine. How you maintain that would be consistent across all of them. But there are some differences. So our goal with single source was when we identify a piece of content, we identify which regulator it's compliant with and tag it appropriately. But then when our instructional designer is building a course, depending on what regulator that course needs to be compliant with, he can pull that appropriate resource. That one resource might be relevant to CASA, EASA, and GCAA. So we've got one resource that's compliant with all those regulations, but relevant to all the course offerings associated with that particular topic or subject.
And Doug, just to give you a time check, we've probably got a couple of minutes left if that's possible.
All right. Yeah, so sorry, I'll quickly illustrate one sample of what we identified with the single source. So part of that process is obviously breaking the courseware down. The other thing was our instructional designer, Chris. He identified that as part of single source, if we could upload our HTML files as a single source resource, then that HTML resource could be then published in the LMS. We would build that resource in the LMS, download it, then re-upload it into Equella, and using the LTI, pull it back into the content. So that gave us very strict control over the content that we deliver. As part of that testing and evaluation that we did, we also identified that the bootstrap files required within the LMS and the style sheets, we could host them within Equella. So again, a single repository for our style sheets and our bootstrap files that we could manipulate and push that out to all of our courses. So a single file, if we needed to change a color or a font size, we can modify the style sheet, and that then is pushed out to every course offering in the LMS that is pointing to that particular file. So that was pretty exciting. So that was one of the big bonuses that we identified as part of this single source process, but it's evolved from, the Equella environment, the Brightspace, and working out how the LTI works between them. So yeah, at the risk of going over or talking too much, that was one of the main things that that I wanted to illustrate today. Yeah, so I guess, has anybody got any questions about that? As long as they're not too technical. I'm not sure of how all of that works. I know that it does. We've done substantial testing because obviously we're already using it, but yeah, other than that, that's the end of my presentation.
Terrific. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Doug. And yeah, great. Lots of great comments around, yeah, just a great use of the workflow tool. Nice to see such a well-organized approach. So one of the things I unsurprisingly have set up is just a quick poll that I'll launch now, just if anyone's got any questions, obviously still add them in, just to get a sense of, are you using workflows at your institution? Please respond. Obviously, Aviation Australia have gone, with a very comprehensive workflow that Carl's been able to help with. But yeah, it works fantastically for their purposes. A question for you, Doug. What has been the user feedback on implementing Equella?
I guess, yeah, we haven't. So at the moment, the Equella is used primarily within our product design and development business unit. It's still, I mean, it is our primary repository, and I guess we're still maturing with it. I don't know that we've had any direct feedback that, from management. Obviously, they're happy that we now have that tool in place and we're controlling our content better. Yeah, I guess I haven't polled them specifically as to what they think of it.
Terrific. No, that's
Sorry.
no, that's fine, Doug, and that might be something we can talk about later. But I've just shared those poll results. So yeah, great to see, you know, quite a number of institutions are using the workflow functionality. But yeah, if you'd like to learn more, obviously chat to us. So.